Hello and welcome. South Asian history over the last decades has had a number of interesting features. One of them has been that dynasties have been created in different parts of the South Asian subcontinent, usually triggered by assassinations. So the assassination of Mrs. Indira Gandhi in India produced the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty. The assassination of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in Bangladesh produced a dynasty led by his daughter. A better known case is, of course, that of the late Benazir Bhutto, when her father was hanged by the military dictatorship in Pakistan. It brought her into politics, and she fought in and out of prison till she'd been elected prime minister, and then her own assassination has spawned a dynasty. In Sri Lanka, Solomon Bandaranaike, one of the first prime ministers of the island after independence, was assassinated by fanatical Buddhist monks who thought he was being too soft on the Tamils in the north. And his assassination brought his wife, Sirimavo Bandaranaike, into power, and then one of her daughters became president. Burma has had a belated version of the same. Aung San Suu Kyi's father, Aung San, was assassinated soon after independence, supposedly by British agents, though we don't know, and the country went into reverse gear, taken over by the military and ruled by the military for many decades. And as Aung San Suu Kyi grew up, she too became interested in politics, and the minute she emerged, she was arrested, locked up, under house arrest, and became an iconic figure amongst human rights circles in the West. Recently, her National League for Democracy won an overwhelming majority in the Burmese elections, though she is barred by the constitution from being the president for the simple reason, or the simple irrationality, that she was married to a foreigner and that her sons are foreign nationals. Why they should debar her for that, of course, remains a mystery, but it means that unless the constitution is changed, she can't be prime minister. Burma is one of the least known countries of South Asia. It's hardly been covered. It was forgotten for a long time till the emergence of Suu Kyi, when her plight encouraged some interest in the West. With me today in the studio is Lee Jones, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University, and an expert on Burma, a country that he has visited. Lee, welcome.
Thanks.
Tell me, how did your own involvement in Burma begin?
Well, I was a student in Japan, and that's where I started learning about international relations and also learning about Southeast Asia. And at that time, Myanmar, Burma was the hot topic in Southeast Asia because it was still under military rule, and the region was in serious difficulties knowing how to handle this situation. It was under a great deal of pressure from the West. So it was the kind of major international relations issue when I first started looking at the region.
Now, should we be calling it Burma or Myanmar? I mean, I know there are some Burmese, which is why I've used Burma, who say that Myanmar is an imposition by the military and we prefer to call it Burma. So what is politically correct here?
Well, it depends on your definition of politically correct. So the country's official name is the Union of the Republic of Myanmar.
Okay.
But that was changed by the military regime in 1989. But the reasons for that were to try and make the country's name more inclusive and to partially decolonize it, because the name Burma is what the British called it when they colonized the country as an extension of the Raj in India. And the name comes from the dominant ethnic group in the country, the Bamar, hence Burma. So from the military government's perspective, calling it Myanmar, which is a name that actually goes back to inscriptions found since the 13th century, is a way to try and make the country's name more multi-ethnic. But of course, those who resist the legitimacy of that change still prefer to call it Burma.
Well, I think we should now revert to calling it Myanmar, now that you've explained this. So when were you last in Burma?
A couple of years ago. So the country has changed a great deal with the shift to the reform period since 2011, and it's changed even more since then. One cannot find a hotel room in Yangon, for example, for less than about $150. So unless you are well endowed with research money, you can find it quite hard to go there and conduct research. Whereas before, the difficulty came from being pursued by military intelligence on your field work and people being very unwilling to speak to you. But when I went there, people were remarkably open. One really did not see military officials on the streets.
How would you describe the demilitarization? Not that it's happened completely, as we know, but what led to it? What led the military to actually making the concessions and permitting elections?
So if we go back to the uprising against the previous one-party state in '88, the military steps in because the state collapses in many areas. And then the military says, okay, we're going to have elections. It results in a landslide for the National League for Democracy. And at that point in time, there's no constitution. And most significantly of all, there are really serious ethnic minority insurgencies around all of Myanmar's borderlands. And these are the world's longest running ethnic insurgencies that the military has been battling for decades. So there's a great fear on the part of the military of the disintegration of the Union, plus the mobilization of the Burma population against the military, which had slaughtered 3,000 people in '88. It made it too dangerous from their perspective to transfer power. So what they tried to do for 20 years was to create a stepwise transition to what they called disciplined flourishing democracy. So from 93 to 96, they convened a so-called national convention. They tried to convince different parts of Myanmar society to accept a constitution drafted by the military, which would safeguard the union, safeguard the military's role in politics and contain civilian squabbling. Now, from at that point in time, there were still many ethnic minority groups fighting against the government that resisted this constitution. And of course, the NLD, the National League for Democracy, rejected it too, and they walked out of the National Convention in '95. So the military was too weak to impose that constitution then. So they shut it down and they engaged in a process of severe repression of democracy activists, and also a process of cultivating ceasefires with the ethnic minority groups by applying enhanced military pressure to them and luring them into business and development deals, so-called ceasefire capitalism, as Kevin Woods has called it. And gradually over time, the military strengthened vis-a-vis its opponents. So it reconvened the National Convention 2008 to 10, 2004 to 8 rather, and basically put the same constitution in front of people. And in a weakened position, the opposition groups essentially agreed.
All of them?
Well, the NLD did not. They were not involved. But groups, for example, that had boycotted the first National Convention campaigned for the new constitution, such as the Kachin Independence Organization. So the 2008 constitution is basically imposed on the country, reflecting that shift in the balance of power. And then you get this stepwise transition. So it's very much a kind of army-developed process, steered and controlled by them. So it's a very long-term process. It's not as if they faced some kind of tipping point or they were forced to do it by sanctions or they suddenly became afraid of China or anything like that. That would ignore the long history of attempts to move in this direction. So the current period is really the culmination of the military regime's plans, although it's certainly not turned out exactly how they would have liked. It's not as if the generals are happy that the NLD has won a landslide, but they are confident in the constitutional constraints on the new government and the continued role for the military in the country's governance.
That's because they've preserved for themselves 25% of the seats in Parliament, saying that these can only be seats occupied by the military.
Right.
I mean, that I think is virtually unique in the parliamentary history of the globe, that seats are occupied in such a way.
That also happened in Indonesia. initially, including after the Suharto transition. So there were seats guaranteed in Parliament for the military, and then gradually that number was reduced down to 0. So they've got 25% of seats in Parliament.
Which is a blocking mechanism.
That's a blocking mechanism on any constitutional change, because you need 75% plus 1 to change the constitution. So they've designed this system and they're not willing to suddenly alter it. They also have immense control other parts of the state. So it's the commander-in-chief of the military forces that is in control of the military and all other coercive apparatus of the state, like the police, not the president. So there is no civilian control over the military. The military also appoints the ministers of Home Affairs, Defence and Border Affairs. And because the Home Affairs Ministry appoints all of the civil servants in the country down to township level, that gives the military enormous control over vast swathes of public policy. 80% of senior civil servants are ex-military. And there's also a kind of amorphous body called the National Defence and Security Council, which has 5 military members out of 11. And this sort of floats above the executive and superintends the business of government, and brings together leaders of the legislature, the executive and the military to kind of discuss broad policy contours. So essentially you've got the military still holding the ring of the new political system.
So essentially, from what you're saying, Lee, it's a token democracy in many ways. If the levers of power are still controlled by the military.
I would say that it's about red lines, and it's about holding the ring. So there's certain wiggle room within these red lines. There are certain things that the military wouldn't tolerate. Severe civilian infighting, an upsurge of insurgency in the borderlands, significant instability that would threaten the integrity of the country and its sovereignty, or moves that would threaten the power and privileges of the military itself, which are seen as essential to safeguard the other goals. But within that, there is significant space, and it varies by issue area. I mean, we've seen from the fact that the National League for Democracy was able to win the election that it was relatively free and fair. But when it comes to things like relations with the ethnic minorities, this is an area where the military has extremely powerful interests and will significantly shape what the government's able to do.
So the massacre of the Rohingyas, who are ethnic minority in that country, Muslims, making them stateless, refusing to give them citizenship, nationality, whatever, was a decision taken by the military.
There's virtually nobody in Myanmar that will accept that the Rohingya are a genuine ethnic minority of the country. So technically there are supposedly 135 national races, so-called national races.
But not the Rohingya.
The Rohingya have never been recognised as one of them.
Why is that?
They are understood to be, by the majority of the population, so-called illegal Bengali immigrants who came in either under colonialism or through the post-colonial period because of weak border controls. So there is a deep resistance on the part of most people in the country to accepting that these people originated in the territory of Burma or Myanmar.
It reminds me of the Tamil question in Sri Lanka, where a large majority of the Sinhala believe, wrongly, that the Tamils are Indian imposition, whereas, you know, the Tamils in the north in particular, I mean, there are two groups of Tamils, the Tamils in the north who have been there for centuries and centuries, and plantation Tamils, more recent Tamils who did come to work the plantations during the colonial period. I mean, there are some similarities with the Rohingya in that, and it creates a huge, huge problem.
It's a massive problem. So there is simply no constituency inside the country for resolving the citizenship issue. So gradually over time, these people have been dispossessed. Initially, they were allowed to vote. Some of them were in parliament. They had supported previous governments in the past. For example, they were issued voting cards in 2010 and voted for the outgoing government, the United Solidarity and Development Party, the front for the military, essentially. But there is now, progressively, they've had their voting cards, their identity papers taken away from them. They've been completely disenfranchised. So with that, there's simply no constituency anywhere in the country for giving this group citizenship. There is a constituency for treating them with greater dignity and respect and treating this as a human rights and humanitarian issue. And I think that's probably the best that we can hope from this government, particularly since Aung San Suu Kyi herself has really been quite silent on this issue.
Yeah, I've noticed she hasn't said anything apart from mild regret for the massacres. She hasn't spoken up on the issue at all. It reminds me again of the Bandaranaike family in Sri Lanka. I mean, after the father Bandaranaike was killed for being too soft on the Tamils, the others fell into line.
I mean, she has transformed from being a very moralistic, hardline democracy icon locked away to a very cold, calculating politician bent on achieving the presidency for herself. And she has clearly made electoral calculations that if she appears to be too soft on the Rohingya and too soft also on the rest of the Muslim population, there's about 5 to 8% of the population are Muslim, and she didn't run a single Muslim candidate in the elections, and she's completely steered away from this issue. It's like the third rail of Myanmar politics. So she has done whatever necessary to kind of win power, and in that sense, she's attracted a lot of criticism in the West for abandoning her previous moral integrity.
Very similar again to the ladies who've been running parts of South Asia over the last decades. Benazir, very similar, started off with very strong moral and social positions on what needed to be done, and then became a corrupt politician. The situation in Bangladesh, India itself, not so dissimilar. So it sort of seems to be a South Asian disease.
I mean, I think it's interesting you introduced it as a South Asian country. Typically it's understood as a Southeast Asian country.
I know, I did
but
it.
I do agree with you that actually it shares much more in common in terms of its communal tensions, in terms of its politics, in terms of its culture, its language and so on. It makes more sense to think of it as a South Asian country.
Well, it's mainly, I say that because it was colonized by the British and run as part of that subcontinent till 1948.
Right.
So all the colonial effects that were felt in the rest of the subcontinent were felt here too.
Exactly, and that has legacies with reference to the Rohingya situation. So one of the things that happens in colonized Burma is there is a large transmigration of ethnic Indians out of the subcontinent into what is now Burma in pursuit of business opportunities, logging, labouring, and the Indians became the commercial class essentially in Burma, and they became involved in money lending, particularly to farmers. And in the 1930s there was a significant financial crisis. The farmers couldn't pay their debts, and Indians therefore became landholders in a significant way. Many people became landless, and this was a big fuel for the anti-colonial movement.
Yeah.
So now when people think about darker-skinned people in Burma, they think about this past. And there's all kinds of legacies about that. So there is a deep racism towards people who are called in Myanmar Kala, people who are the dark ones.
Dark ones.
And that is, I think, part of the kind of xenophobic form of nationalism that emerged in Myanmar. So there are deep legacies.
It's a bit like what you're describing is not totally unlike the xenophobia towards overseas Chinese, so-called overseas Chinese in countries like Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia.
But it's odd that although there are real concerns about that among many people, particularly the Burma, they're kind of this xenophobic nationalism, you often don't find very open criticisms of the Chinese. And you don't get these kind of pogroms or anything like that.
Like we see against the Rohingya.
Absolutely, or against Muslims more generally, because of course the violence starts in Arakan State where the Rohingya are located, but it spreads to other parts of the country in 2011-12. So there are attacks on Muslims in other parts of the country who are not ethnic Rohingya. But you don't see the same kind of attacks on China, and I've often thought that the Chinese are just too powerful a community backed by a very powerful state to attack in that way, as are the crony capitalists established by the previous military regime. Whereas nobody really cares. Nobody's going to go to bat for the Muslims or the Rohingya, so they're a safe community to take out your economic, social and political frustrations.
Lee, since you've raised the question of China, let's discuss the impact of Chinese investment in Myanmar and the speed with which it's grown. And could you also tell me something about how the West reacted to the Chinese entry. Did they just accept it as being obviously part of that region, so it's hardly a surprise that the new China is investing in Burma, or were there rumblings behind the scenes? Also, it was rumored and written about too that Suu Kyi was the big white hope of the West in terms of balancing out Chinese influence with the military in Myanmar and possibly bringing in a more Western, pro-Western regime.
So that's definitely true. But I think for many years, the West's geopolitical logics were sidelined by the concern for human rights and democracy. So there was a lot of support for Suu Kyi. Essentially, Western policy became harnessed to what Suu Kyi wanted. And what that meant was years of sanctions and isolation for the Myanmar government from the West, which essentially allowed Asian governments, including China, to steal a march. So the kind of geopolitical logics that many people think always drive states were kind of cast aside.
You mean realist geopolitics?
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes. So the idea that you kind of have to go in and balance China, this is a relatively new thing emerging from Obama's pivot to Asia since 2009. So now the West rocks up basically and finds that large parts of the Burmese economy are actually in Chinese hands. Now, the policy of the Myanmar government has always, I think, been the same, basically, since independence, which is that it prefers equidistance, as most Southeast Asian states do. They want to be between the major powers, they want to get benefits from them all, they don't want to be too close or too dependent on any one individual power. Myanmar was forced to rely on the Chinese during the years of Western sanctions, and it didn't like that. It didn't like becoming economically dependent or diplomatically dependent on Chinese protection at the Security Council or anything like that. So when the opportunity came after 2009 and with the onset of the reform era, Myanmar has somewhat rebalanced itself. It suspended a major Chinese dam project at Myitsone, and it has tried to cultivate stronger ties with the West. But it would always wanted to do these things. It just was not able to do so because of Western policy.
And British investment in Myanmar more or less ignored the sanctions?
There was some pre-existing British investment. So the investment sanctions didn't come on until the late 90s. That was on new investments. Existing investments were protected.
It was fine.
So oil and gas is basically where Western interests have been there all the way through the period.
Yeah.
And if you look at where investment actually happens in Myanmar, it is overwhelmingly concentrated in the extractive industries. Oil and gas, mining, logging, hydropower. And the Chinese are the dominant investors, but the Thais are also a significant force. And the West ranks well behind those. So many Chinese investments have been in the borderland areas, which is where those areas are relatively undeveloped. The pristine forests, lots of great natural resources, jade, copper mining, things like this. And Chinese investors have gone in there on a vast scale. And these investments have often exacerbated the conflicts in the border regions. So if we look at the Kachin area, for example, there was a 14-year-long ceasefire between the Kachin Independence Organization and the Myanmar government, broke down in 2011. And this is deeply linked to Chinese resource investments. So they have massively deforested large parts of the Kachin state. They've taken more and more a share of mining in the region, and they've pursued hydropower projects that have massively displaced local populations. And the leaders of the Kachin ceasefire groups have been gradually squeezed out of these profitable deals, and a new generation of activists and organisers has emerged in opposition to these cronyistic deals between the regime, military commanders, foreign investors, local businessmen, and have revitalised the insurgencies.
Why do you think that these semi-insurrections, a permanent state of tension between some ethnic minorities in the central state, have persisted for such a long time in Burma?
They are the world's longest running ethnic insurgencies. I mean, they are quite remarkable. I think fundamentally, there's never been a consensus on the shape, form, and nature of the post-independence state. And different forces have tried to impose a consensus by force and never been able to do it. So fundamentally, I mean, it dates back to the colonial period. So you had basically diarchy, where the central Burma, the Burma areas, were ruled directly by the Raj, and then the surrounding areas in what are now the borderlands were ruled through proxies, essentially local chieftains or local princes.
Like the princely states in India?
To a certain extent, although I think those states were always a bit more integrated into the Raj than the
Burmese.
The Shan state and so on were never that well integrated into British rule. So when the British very quickly tried to decolonize Burma after the Second World War, these states said, we've never been part of Burma. We don't want to be part of it. And so there was a very kind of hurried set of negotiations where the British tried to cobble something together, and talks at Panglong between Aung San and the leaders of 6 major ethnic groups, which there was a kind of vague commitment to implementing some kind of federal settlement. But it was never really implemented. And so almost since independence, there have been insurgencies against the central state. The army becomes an instrument of the dominant Burma group. That becomes the instrument of state building. A very coercive mindset. Basically, the ethnic minorities, resistance groups have to be defeated and forcibly incorporated. So the big issues have never been settled, which is about the sharing of power, the sharing of resources, particularly natural resources, and also cultural autonomy. This is a big issue for the ethnic minorities. They don't want to be forcibly Burmanized. They don't want to be forcibly converted to Buddhism, as happened in some areas, because some of these groups are Christian or animist, for example. These are the big issues. But these groups have now mostly abandoned their demand for independent states. So they've abandoned their separatist ambitions. They know it's never going to happen.
They want autonomy.
They're looking for autonomy. They're looking for some degree of decentralization within a union state. Not necessarily federalism in the way we understand it in the West, but some control over natural resources, some political autonomy, and some control over their cultural affairs. Not really asking for anything unreasonable, but the Burma elite has always been very resistant to giving them what they want. They're very fearful of these centrifugal forces.
And Lee, if you had to predict the next 10 years, what do you think is going to happen?
I would hope that there will be some significant moves towards genuine peace settlement. That is the government's top priority, self-declared, and I think it's absolutely the right priority.
And it's possible?
I think it's possible. I think all sides are now ready, that they realise that the old strategies have not worked. The question is whether the military is going to allow changes in the constitution to allow greater power sharing, genuine power sharing. And there's also issues around the sequencing of the conversion of these ethnic minority militia groups into elements in the Myanmar armed forces. This is a real sticking point. It won't be easy. It'll be terribly difficult. But it is a top priority for the government, and I think there is some scope for movement forwards.
What did the WikiLeaks file reveal as far as Myanmar was concerned?
It revealed that sanctions were not working. They were a miserable failure. So all of the documents show that the United States Embassy was completely aware of this fact, that the sanctions were harming people opposed to the government or with no links to the government, whereas the crony capitalists were, expanding their business all the time. But there was this bizarre idea expressed in one cable that if we just apply one more turn of the screw, the people will rise up. The labour unions will somehow, the impoverished workers who are getting poorer and poorer, they will somehow rise up and overthrow the regime. It was total and utter rubbish. The other interesting cable I found was this desperate attempt to divine the wishes of Aung San Suu Kyi. So, because Western policy is was then very much directed by what she wanted, but she wasn't able to say what she wanted. It was illegal to call for sanctions, and she was trying to retain a legal position. So you have these very awkward meetings where Western diplomats, with military representatives there, are trying to work out what does she want us to do. So it speaks to the total disarray and failure of Western policy over the course of 20 years.
Lee Jones, thank you very much.
Thank you.